But I mean, when he comes on, you can start recording.
Oh, it's already started.
I started it. I'm
Oh,
exercising my
co-hosting
my
abilities.
power as a co-host.
Ah,
So you know it's Orange Week, eh? You all know that?
What's that mean? Orange.
It's against violence. Well, against violence against women. It's the Society for Africa and Three Oaks and another organization.
and they
I can
say
look
to
it
wear
up.
orange?
Yeah. Yes, because it's a bright and cheerful color.
Yeah, well, it's also got some other meanings, you know.
Yeah, for Orangeman, the Orangeman.
Anti-Catholic, the Orange Society was
Yeah.
a terrorist group.
Yeah.
And the NDP too, and this is a green meeting, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes, it is. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Oh, here's
Orange
Dimitri.
World.
Okay.
Yay.
Hey, everybody. Sorry about that. Got a little hold up.
No problem.
doing?
We were just did you have any trouble signing in?
No, I was on another Zoom call and I was trying desperately to get off. It had to do. We have a November
Back
3rd.
to that.
We're trying to, in the federal party, we have the November 30th deadline for policy resolutions. So
Right.
there's a lot of scrambling going on right now to get those
Yes.
done. My apologies.
Oh,
So-
no problem.
I hope you're all doing well.
So you're starting a new beard.
Yeah, or I'm just haven't shaven for 3 days. There's a
I thought you were taking a tip from Justin on.
No, God, no.
Yeah.
No, I think Justin's trying to look more mature during this
Yeah.
period of stress for Canadians. He wants to come across as the age, leader who has wisdom to offer us. That's my
Right.
guess, but who knows?
Yeah.
So, how would you like to proceed? I'm ready to launch into my discussion about fiscal conservatism, but I leave it open to you guys, to make any preliminary comments you want to make before I begin.
Yes, well, I thought I would just welcome everyone here from the Bay of Quinte Greens. We were so lucky to have Dimitri come to speak tonight. And I just wanted to mention that if you guys have questions, can you put them in the chat, which is the bottom of your screen. And then we'll do question and answer afterwards, after he speaks. And what was the other thing? I think that's it. Now Lynn's going to introduce you. Hang on, I'm gonna switch slides. Is that right? Hi, Dimitri.
Hi, how you doing, Lynn?
I'm great.
Yeah.
I'm to introduce you, so bear with me.
Okay.
Close your
I
eyes.
thought you were just going to go, here's Dimitri, and that
Well,
was
I
going to
could do that and avoid everything else, but I think maybe people deserve, a little bit of your background, right?
Go ahead, sure.
Okay, right. Well, anyway, I feel really happy and very privileged to be able to introduce Dimitri. I met Dimitri a few years ago, not in person, but online. And I started receiving correspondence and articles and various things. And I thought, gee, I like the way this person's talking. I sort of identify with what he's saying. And then, excuse me. And then I had other friends who were sending me, as they always do, various emails and things. And again, it was what you were writing about. And I thought, gee, this is really interesting. And then when I heard that you were running for the leadership of the Green Party, I right away joined up to the Green Party because I knew I had to do everything in my power, because you were the voice and are the voice that I wanted to hear. And the things I like about you, one of them in particular, is that you go directly to the issue. You don't go around the periphery of the issue at all. You go directly to it. You tell us what it is, and you tell us how we can make the changes. And I really like that. So, excuse me. I think a lot of people have different thinkers that they always refer to. excuse me. And like other people, I have a handful at least of people who I look for direction, to help me with a deeper meaning, to broaden my brain, to make me think more about different things, and especially all the political things that are going on right now. And that's why, again, another reason why I value what you do for us so very much. So to give people a bit of a background, you graduated, I'm going to tell you now your history, rightly or wrongly. But you graduated from the Faculty of Law in 1991 from the U of T, and you had a distinguished law career working on Wall Street and in Paris, France for a few years. You were representing a large financial institution in connection with major security offerings. And in 2004, you joined one of Canada's leading class action law firms, and where you co-founded and led Canada's largest and most accomplished team of class action lawyers. And then in 2012, you were named as one of the most influential lawyers in Canada. Wow. And the year after that, you were named to be one of the most influential persons in Canadian business. So in 2016, you decided to leave the corporate world, and you made a big change for yourself because you wanted to devote yourself to journalism and activism and pro bono legal work. Is where you are at this point in time. So you have served as the justice critic in the shadow cabinet of the Green Party, and the same in the Green Party of Quebec. And I guess your biggest step forward was this March of 2020, when you found the courage to announce your candidacy for the Green Party of Canada. Wow, that was a big step.
Courage is a good way to put it, yeah.
Yeah, it was. And you finished second place out of 8 candidates who were in the race, which was marvelous. And you garnered 45.5 of the votes, which is another great accomplishment. So right now you live in Montreal, and you're happily married, and you have 2 grown children, and you give credit to your successes, to their support, and to their love, which is great. And so tonight you're going to be speaking to us on fiscal conservatism. You're going to help us see what it is and why it's deeply flawed, and how it's holding us all back. So we're all anxious to hear what you have to say, and to get more involved in the discussions through some questions. So Dimitri, here's Dimitri.
McMahon.
Yeah.
Thank you for that very gracious introduction. And thank you for inviting me. I understand this is the first in a series of talks you've been planning. I'm honored to be your inaugural speaker. And I want to acknowledge at the outset that I'm coming to you from the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka people, on whose territory I am now privileged to live and work. And I'd like to just sort of say at the outset why I chose this subject of fiscal conservatism. And, you know, I'm going to get into sort of the granularity of the concept and talk to you about economic statistics and principles. The bottom line is I thought this is an important subject because this affects everything, absolutely everything. Our attitude towards government spending has profound implications for dealing with the climate crisis, dealing with our healthcare system, dealing with our education system, dealing with poverty in our society, you know, funding foreign projects that in other jurisdictions to advance the economic and social well-being of peoples who are less fortunate than ourselves. It affects everything. And if we don't have a sound understanding of the capacity of our governments to spend, then probably what we're going to end up doing is under-allocating or misallocating resources to the things that we need most urgently to deal with in order to preserve the livability of our planet, the health of our democracy, and some semblance of social justice in our society. So I cannot overestimate the importance of understanding the government's capacity to spend. And this whole concept of fiscal conservatism is one that has, in my opinion, infected our thinking about government spending in ways that are most unhealthy. And in fact, I would go so far as to say in ways that are imperiling the future of our species. So with that, I'll say a couple of words about what fiscal conservatism is, as I mean it. It's in general a belief that the government, any government is like a household or a business, and therefore must generally seek to balance their budgets and to ensure that over a medium to longer term, expenditures do not exceed revenues. And the theory is that, you know, if governments continue to incur debt and do not generally balance their budgets, eventually their debt service obligations will outstrip their capacity to service the debt, and this will result in default, in debt default, which itself will lead to a cascade of economic problems and suffering. Now, the analogy to a household or a business, however, is completely false and inapposite for three reasons at least. The first reason is that a government has the power to tax. A household and business don't have the power to tax. You know, the CEO of a corporation can't pass a law and say that, you know, some particular segment of the society or some group of corporations are going to have to pay increased taxes to the government. And this is an extraordinarily important source of potential revenue to the government. The second major distinction between a government on the one hand and businesses and households on the other is that government, particularly the federal government of Canada, has a gigantic asset base. And what does this mean? This means that it has security for its debt obligations, which provide a high level of assurance to its lenders that it ultimately will be able to pay its debts. And so, you know, one of the things I did, Lynn mentioned that I worked on Wall Street. One of the categories of issuers that I represented most frequently, especially when I was living in practicing in Europe, were sovereign issuers. Sovereign issuers means governments that are issuing securities to the capital markets or state-owned or state-controlled enterprises. One of the biggest sovereign issuers that I represented when I was in Paris, I had the opportunity to do tens of billions of euros of debt offerings for this entity is the German development bank, Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, which was at that point in time financing the unification of Western Germany and Eastern Germany. And it was issuing truly gigantic amounts of bonds and incurring massive debt, which ultimately the German government was on the hook for, but it was paying relative to corporate issuers a tiny level of interest. Because why? Because the German government has a gigantic asset base, which is well beyond that of the vast majority of business enterprises that seek to borrow money in the capital markets. But the third and perhaps most important reason why governments are not analogous to households and businesses is that governments that have control of their own currency can always create more currency and as much currency as is needed in order to service their debt obligations. Households and businesses don't have a money tree. Well, I'm here to tell you that governments do. And that money tree in our country is called the Bank of Canada. It can actually generate currency within certain economic constraints. Really, the one economic constraint that the Bank of Canada has to worry about is when the economy is operating at full capacity, which it is not doing now. It's not even close to doing that and hasn't been for some time. Creating currency can generate inflation in that one narrow circumstance. And I'm going to come back to that. But as a general matter, and I'll explain to you why, currency creation, even in quite aggressive amounts, does not generally lead historically to excess inflation. And this brings me to something known as modern monetary theory, or MMT. And the basic premise of MMT is that a state which controls its own currency and whose debts are denominated largely in that currency can never go broke because it can always create more currency to service its debts. And as I've indicated, the principal critique that classical mainstream economists apply to money creation, or what the basic principle that MMT champions, is that money creation generates excess inflation, and in the most severe cases, hyperinflation. Now, hyperinflation does indeed have severe economic impacts, but does the economic evidence support the claim that aggressive money creation generally results in hyperinflation? And the answer is a resounding no. And before I explain why, I want to explain another economic term that you may have heard a lot in recent years, particularly since the financial crisis of 2007, 2009, and that term is quantitative easing, or QE. Quantitative easing is a form of unconventional monetary policy in which a central bank purchases longer-term government securities and other securities from the open market in order to increase the money supply and encourage lending and investment. Now, in the 2007 to 2009 financial crisis, the four major central banks, the central banks of Europe, China, Japan, and the Federal Reserve of the United States, engaged in unprecedented levels of quantitative easing, just a fancy word for money creation. By 2016, these four central banks had pumped more than US $9 trillion into the global economy since the financial crisis in a bid to boost growth, inflation, and employment. And yet not one of these jurisdictions experienced hyperinflation. In fact, on the contrary, at some points during this period, these jurisdictions, Japan and the ECB in particular, were confronted by a much higher risk of deflation rather than excess inflation. And as said by Michael Pierce in 2016, he's the global economist at Capital Economics. If you brought a group of economists from 2008 to the present day and told them that central banks had bought 9 trillion in assets and were still looking for ways to boost inflation, I don't think they would believe you. In fact, I'm quite sure that they wouldn't believe you, especially if we're talking about classical economists. Now let's look more closely at the case of Japan, one of those four jurisdictions I mentioned whose central bank has engaged in massive quantitative easing since the financial crisis. As of 2018, Japan had a debt to GDP ratio of 254%, the highest in the world. And it's been the highest in the world for some time. Its central bank has pursued decades of unconventional monetary policy. Starting in the late 1980s, the Bank of Japan has engaged in aggressive quantitative easing in at least 15 years. And at no time during this extended period, at no time has the country of Japan experienced excess inflation, let alone hyperinflation. On the contrary, as I indicated, there have been various points in time where the Japanese government has struggled to prevent deflation, despite the massive amounts of money creation that were occurring or had been undertaken by the Bank of Japan during this period. What is going on with inflation at the current time and historically in Japan, which has created so much money and has so much debt? So far in 2020, Japan's annualized inflation rate is running at well under 0.5%. In October, the Japanese consumer price index actually fell by 0.4%. So prices actually are decreasing as of October in Japan, despite the massive amount of currency that has been created both during the pandemic and prior to the pandemic. In essence, the hyperinflation bogeyman, despite what classical neoliberal economists tell us, is nowhere to be seen. And moreover, despite its relatively high debt, the yield on Japan's 10-year bond is currently 0.018%. So that is basically no interest. The government of Japan, despite having the highest debt to GDP ratio in the world, is paying effectively no interest on its debt and effectively is experiencing no meaningful inflation. And in fact, at the current point in time, may even be at a risk of a deflationary cycle. How does Canada compare to Japan? In 2019, Canada's debt to GDP ratio was approximately 90%. So well under 50% of Japan's debt to GDP ratio. The debt to GDP ratio will increase sharply, of course, in Canada due to the unprecedented federal and provincial government spending undertaken to deal with the pandemic. But Canada's debt to GDP ratio will very likely remain well under half of Japan's debt to GDP ratio, even after we emerge from the pandemic. How has Canada's government, this is something you do not hear too much discussion in the economic or the financial press about this, how has Canada's government financed these unprecedented levels of spending during the pandemic? Well, starting on April 1st, the Bank of Canada commenced buying at least $5 billion of Government of Canada bonds every week It joined the club of quantitative easing of central banks. The bank pledged to continue that weekly pace until the economy was well into its eventual post-pandemic recovery. The QE program will likely continue for at least a year, therefore, adding 250 billion or more to the Bank of Canada's already substantial holdings of federal bonds. Meanwhile, in Canada, there is absolutely no hint of inflation, and the government is paying rock bottom rates of interest on its bonds, even to this very day. In October of this past month, the annual inflation rate in Canada was a mere 0.7%, and in September it was even lower. The annualized rate of inflation was 0.5%. So there's simply zero evidence that the Bank of Canada's extraordinary levels of money creation are exposing Canada to a significant risk of hyperinflation. It's interesting, despite all of this economic evidence, to compare or to analyze how the corporate media are reacting to these unprecedented levels of government spending. And I wanted to quote a few words for you from a recent article in Post Media, which owns the National Post and is Canada's largest newspaper publisher. And I'm quoting, "Within 15 years, our federal debt could be $1 trillion. This is the first time trillion has ever seriously been used in any public policy discussions about this country's debt. It's an alarming fact. It could take all the way, it took all the way from 1867 to 2010 to hit the 500 billion debt mark, yet it's now possible Ottawa could double that number in about 20 years. The other scary revelation is just how long it might take to balance the budget. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau initially campaigned on getting back to black by 2019. This was much later than what former Conservative PM Stephen Harper and NDP leader Tom Mulcair pledged to do. They both wanted to balance the books immediately. Canadians were surprised to learn in the fall economic update last year that Trudeau's government had pushed the goalpost back. Now they won't be balancing the books, horror of horrors, until sometime after 2021. Now, if anybody with an ounce of economic sense, looking at this article critically, would say, well, what is the magic about $1 trillion? Where's the economic evidence that a country like Canada, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, having $1 trillion of debt is actually going to result in hyperinflation, is going to result in Canada defaulting on its debt, is going to result in other adverse economic circumstances? There's simply none. The number $1 trillion has absolutely no economic significance. It just sounds big. And that's why the National Post is feeding it to you. What is the significance of the fact that Canada, accumulated $500 billion of debt, or is going to do that apparently in 20 years, but it took from 1867 to 2010 to hit the $500 billion debt mark? In and of itself, that information means absolutely nothing. It tells you nothing about the sustainability of Canada's debt. All it tells you is that in nominal terms, the second $500 billion of debt was incurred much faster than the first $500 billion of debt. But so what? Why is that necessarily going to lead to negative economic repercussions? When you look at the evidence, it doesn't actually support the proposition that that will necessarily result in negative economic repercussions. And this is what the financial and corporate press do in this country constantly. They throw numbers out of a hat. They sound big. They show, the debt, the rate at which we're accumulating debt is accelerating relative to historical periods. But they don't actually ever produce a cogent, evidence-based argument for why that's something that we should be alarmed about as Canadians. And that is the word that the National Post used in that article. It said we should be alarmed. Now, I want to talk about another case, a case that's very close to me because I have family in this country, but also because it's something that I devoted a lot of time to as a journalist of the Real News. And that is the case of Greece. In the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009, or in the lead up to the financial crisis, Greek banks borrowed, and by the way, those banks were owned by some very unsavory people and engaged in extraordinary levels of corruption and mismanagement. And in the lead up to the financial crisis, they borrowed large amounts of money from other banks, from other countries, principally French and German banks. And when the financial crisis hit, the Greek banking system was on the verge of collapse because of the mismanagement and corruption of its private owners, not of the government, not of the Greek people generally, but because of the oligarchs who controlled the Greek banking system. And the leaders of Europe became alarmed because their own banks, particularly Société Générale in France and Deutsche Bank in Germany, and other banks as well, were themselves on the brink of collapse due to reckless financial practices and in some cases outright fraud. And if Greece's banks defaulted on their debt, that was potentially just enough to push them over the cliff. So what did Greece's creditors, what did the IMF and the European Central Bank and the European Commission demand of Greece's government? It demanded that Greece's government assume a gigantic level of debt in order to recapitalize Greece's banks so that they would be able to pay off their German and French and other creditors. This has become known as the bailout of Greece. In fact, it was not a bailout of Greece. It was a bailout of French and German banks. But it was the Greek people who were saddled with the burden of ensuring that the French and German banks, who were reckless in lending money to the corrupt, privately owned banking system of Greece, that they themselves did not collapse. And so the price that was imposed upon the Greek people was bad enough that Greece was required to assume the burden of ensuring that Greek banks paid back the French and German banks. But the price that was imposed upon Greece was a program of what one could fairly describe as extreme fiscal conservatism. The creditors of Greece demanded not only that Greece run balanced budgets, but that it actually run a primary surplus year after year after year. A primary surplus is just the amount of money that's left over before debt service obligations. And historically, virtually no country had run a substantial primary surplus for an extended period of time without wrecking its economy. And that's in fact exactly what happened to Greece. Greece accepted, it was forced to accept by Greece's creditors an extreme form of fiscal conservatism. And what happened? Its economy contracted by over 25%, which was approximately the level at which the US economy contracted during the Great Depression. The unemployment rate, the general unemployment rate in Greece from 2010 to 2015 soared to 27%, which was higher than the height of unemployment in the United States during the Great Depression. Greece suffered an extraordinary brain drain. In a country whose population was approximately 11 million people, over 500,000 people, many of them amongst the most educated people in Greece, fled to other jurisdictions where they could find work, principally Germany and France. And these Greeks, these young Greeks, had been educated at the expense of Greek taxpayers. But they were now going off in order and applying their skills to their positions in the very countries that had imposed upon Greece an inhumane austerity regime. Now, Greece was in a bind. If Greece had control of its own currency, it could have printed the money in order to service its own debt. The problem was that Greece had entered the Eurozone and had surrendered sovereignty over its own currency. And the control of the money supply was now in the hands of the European Central Bank, whose leader, Mario Draghi, was a classical neoliberal economist. And so Greece did not have the opportunity to do what other countries like Canada can do, which is to create money in order to service its debt obligations. And it was therefore trapped, and it had no alternative. And without the support of the Central Bank of Europe and the IMF and the European Commission, its banking system would have collapsed, which would have caused immense suffering amongst the Greek people. The case of Greece, in fact, is proof that fiscal conservatism is economic voodoo. That's all it is at the end of the day. And anybody who tells you otherwise, challenge them to produce the evidence that this is actually sound economic policy. And the last thing I want to say, is that, when we talk about balancing budgets in priority to dealing with crises that are of an existential nature, I do not understand how we could possibly regard the people who are propounding that approach to government finance management as moderates or as conservatives. We are confronted, as probably every single person on this call knows, by an existential climate crisis. Restraining the government from spending the money that is necessary in order to resolve that crisis is the height of extremism, fanaticism, and the opposite of moderation and conservatism. Even if it were true that we are confronted by a choice between hyperinflation and wrecking the planet, I would take hyperinflation. Even if it were true that we were confronted by a choice between saving the planet and defaulting on our national debt, I would take defaulting on our national debt. There is no priority higher than the preservation of our planet and the livability of this earth upon which we all and all of our children depend. The true moderates, the true conservatives, are those who say we as a country are going to do whatever it takes in order to resolve the climate emergency, even if that means that we have to incur massive amounts of debt. That's moderation. That is evidence-based thinking. But I'm here to tell you that, in fact, we are not confronted by that choice. We actually can resolve the climate emergency without defaulting on our debt. We can resolve the climate emergency without incurring hyperinflation. So the next time somebody accuses you, if you happen to be of the view that we should be spending a lot of money to deal with the climate crisis, of being immoderate, of being an extremist, of being economically responsible, you tell those people to take a look in the mirror, because that's exactly what they are being. So those are my comments on the whole question of fiscal conservatism, and I look forward to having a robust discussion with you all this evening.
Hi, Dimitri. My name is Jim Colby, and I'm the secretary. And I have a list of questions, and I'd like to read them to you one at a time as they've been written down in the chat thing. And then you can respond. How's that?
That's fine, Jim. Thank you.
Okay. The first one comes from Dawn and Heather Ross. It's, I'm reading. When it comes to a time for questions, I would like to ask how he feels about the risks of stranded assets being held by so many banks and pension funds in fossil fuel industries. How can we change this misguided path by directing that money into 21st century industries that will help us fight climate change and create lasting jobs, renewable energy, etc.?
Well, thank you for the question. Stranded assets are something that are a great concern to me as a professional, because I dealt with my job as a class actions lawyer was capital markets fraud, public corporations making false or misleading statements to the public. And I am personally of the view that Canada's oil patch is committing massive securities fraud. They are telling the public, implicitly or explicitly, that they can exploit their known resources without wrecking the planet. And that is absolutely false. As James Hansen, former NASA scientist, said, if we fully exploit the resources of the tar sand sector, it is game over for the climate. Game over. There is no real world in which the tar sand sector and many other actors in the fossil fuels industry, particularly coal, can exploit their known resources, let alone the ones they're currently trying to develop through hundreds of billions of dollars of expenditure in exploration. There's no real world in which they can do that without destroying the planet. And so any claim by a company that its valuation should be based upon its known resources is securities fraud. It's a fraud. And the problem that we have in this country, is that our securities regulators, it's not just Canada. This is also true in the United States, where I practice securities law. It's true in Europe, where I practice securities law. They will not force fossil fuel companies to actually tell the public the truth about the exploitability of their resources. And in fact, they're doing the precise opposite. As I indicated, they're going out and they're spending massive sums on developing new resources. And our governments are allowing them to do that, even subsidizing that kind of activity. There's one sort of voice of rationality in this whole cacophony of lies, and that's Carney, the former governor of the Bank of Canada, who became, Mark Carney became, as many of you will know, the governor of the Bank of England. And he actually has led a lonely mission to try to get, and he's not demanding full disclosure, let's be very clear. What he's proposing is actually quite modest and not enough. But he's been sounding the alarm about the fact that eventually the capital markets are going to wake up to the fact that these massive resources upon which the valuations of fossil fuel companies depend and by implication, the valuations of companies that lend to them, like our major banks depend, that these valuations are false, and then we're going to find ourselves in a financial crisis that'll be far worse than the one we saw from 2007, 2009. So I think we need to put maximum pressure on our regulators to force the fossil fuels industry to make fulsome disclosure based on science of what proportion of their assets are actually exploitable without destroying the planet. This will be a painful exercise that will result in massive devaluation of fossil fuel company capitalization, but eventually it's going to have to be done, and the sooner we do it, the less painful it's going to be.
Thank you. Thank you, Dimitri. I have another question from David Woodbury, and he says, Dimitri, do you need us to sign on to your GPC policy proposals? That's the question.
I don't need it, but I would welcome it. The more sponsors we have for our policy proposals, you know, the more weight they will have when the members come to determining whether or not to support them. I've already submitted myself, I'm the submitter of a resolution which aims to democratize the policy process. Right now, the GPC, in my opinion, has imposed upon the members' ability to formulate policy restrictions that are unreasonable. So I'm proposing a bylaw amendment which will get rid of those restrictions. We've just submitted a proposal for tax reform, in particular taxing the wealthy and the ultra wealthy. We're putting in a proposal about a postal savings bank. We're putting in a proposal about making the polluter pay in all sectors of our economy, not just the fossil fuel sector. If you are interested in knowing more about our proposals, I won't go through them all. Please feel free to send me an email afterwards, and I will forward to you these proposals, and you can let us know by email whether you're prepared to co-sponsor them.
Okay, well, thank you. I have another question. This person writes, I would like to ask how the infrastructure bank works versus the Bank of Canada.
Well, the infrastructure bank, the person who knows most about this is Linda McQuaig. Linda McQuaig just authored a book called The Sport and Prey of Capitalists, which I've gotten about 2/3 of the way through reading. And she has an excellent critique in there about the infrastructure bank. I'm convinced after having read, there it is. I cannot recommend strongly enough that you read that book. And not only this part about the infrastructure bank, but the part that really is pertinent for us at this point in time in our history is the part about Connaught Labs, which was a state-controlled pharmaceutical company that we sorely miss today in the pandemic. But I recommend you read that book. And you know, I think Linda makes a very persuasive case that our infrastructure bank is a scam. It's just a way for private actors, for big banks, hedge funds to make a lot of money on the backs of Canadian taxpayers. And in fact, we don't need their investment, in part for reasons that I've already articulated about our spending capacity, in order to enhance our infrastructure. We don't need their help. And if we invite it, all we're going to do is get ripped off.
Okay, thank you. From Anne Grant, do you have a comment about the way that the Trudeau government is supporting corporations without asking for anything in return, like some sort of public ownership? What about banks profiting from loans they are making now and then raking in the profits later, again, without making any concessions to the public? Why don't the people control the banks?
Well, that's a great question. I think the answer is because our politicians are, you know, anytime a government bails out, I mean, it rarely should a government bail out the private sector. I mean, if you actually believe in this free market nonsense, you know, and the survival of the fittest logic that prevails in our economy, then when a big corporation, you know, is run into the ground by mismanagement, then the shareholders should just have to pay the price for that. And if you're going to bail out anybody, it should be the workers. Of course, the workers should be helped, and new employment should be found for them. And the government, shareholders and executives. Anytime we lend money to an industry, if there is a compelling reason to do that, in order to sustain the industry, there should be some basic restrictions imposed upon what can be done with that money. So first of all, there should be a complete prohibition for an extended period of time on executive bonuses. Absolutely no executive bonuses. You should bar dividends for an extended period of time until at least the money is paid back with interest. You should require that there be no layoffs and that there be no reduction in the pay of the existing workforce. You should prevent share buybacks, which have been used to inflate enormously the value of stock options that are owned by the executives in this country. In fact, that's really much the only rationale you have for share buybacks in this country, is that they inflate executive compensation. There's no economic logic to them at all. But our government is imposing those restrictions. It just hands out money willy-nilly to industries, first of all, that don't deserve it, and secondly, without imposing the kinds of restrictions that we should be imposing in order to protect the public.
Okay, thank you. This is from Jacqueline Miller. And Jacqueline asks, how does the debt equation you discuss relate to Canada's debt to the World Bank, especially with regards to percentage of GPA? I am a little unclear here.
That's a very good question. I don't know what Canada's debt to the World Bank is. And my understanding of the World Bank is that its existence is primarily to fund development in countries that aren't as wealthy as Canada. So if we have significant debt to the World Bank, I'd be surprised about that. It could be the case, but unfortunately, I don't know enough about our obligations to the World Bank to be able to answer your question. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, okay. This is from Daniel Draper. He asks, on the topic of inflation, what do you believe would lead the market, in a broad sense, to dump CAD over the protracted period? And CAD is capitalized.
Canadian dollars.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
What do I believe what would cause people to dump Canadian dollars en masse, investors? Is that
over a protracted?
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
That's right. So I'm wondering about just your take on that.
Oh, okay.
Well, excess inflation might do that. It might cause them to dump money. If they thought that the government was at risk of defaulting on its debt, that might cause them to dump the money. But short of some extreme circumstances like that, which we are not even remotely close to finding ourselves in, I think the Canadian dollar, remains a fairly attractive and stable currency and will for the foreseeable future. I think Canada is, ideally situated relative to the vast majority of countries in this world to deploy massive financial resources to deal with things like the pandemic, the climate crisis, without destabilizing the economy and without causing a devaluation of our currency. I just don't see anything on the horizon that would cause Canadian investors to want to dump Canadian currency en masse.
Okay. Jacqueline Miller asks, the equation of climate change mitigation has many factors. Addition to extraction, area loss, as opposed to carbon sink loss, is significant. What are your thoughts on conservancy of carbon sink habitats in policy?
Well, I think that's absolutely essential. I mean, I couldn't be more in agreement that the government should be doing everything possible to preserve carbon sinks. Unfortunately, it's doing precisely the opposite. It hasn't even begun to deliver on its promise to, I think it was 1 billion trees that the Trudeau government said that it was going to ensure were planted. It's not even begun to deliver on that promise. So this should be the highest priority for the government right now. Bringing to bear all the tools at our disposal, including the preservation of carbon sinks and the creation of new carbon sinks in order to manage the level of CO2 in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases. Unfortunately, we're just not seeing it, but yeah, it should be the highest priority.
Okay, thank you. This is from Dawn Williford. If we can run a deficit, should the federal government fund only federal programs, or finance provinces or municipalities or individual Canadians?
It should do all of those things, and it has the capacity to do all of those things. You know, the one thing we should bear in mind, you know, provincial governments do not have the power to create currency. The Bank of Canada is not under their control. And municipal governments are even more constrained than provincial governments because they are at the mercy of provincial legislatures, which are themselves financially constrained relative to the federal government. The federal government should be assisting all other levels of government in order to meet the needs of people, both locally and nationally. And we can do that. And so, for example, you know, this unseemly debate that we have periodically about the financing of our healthcare system from the federal government.
Yeah.
On this, I'm on the side of the provinces who are constantly demanding more money. The money is there. Don't let the federal government tell you otherwise. And if we want to see robust healthcare across the country, we just see massive increases in healthcare funding from the federal government.
Okay. Well, you know, I don't have any more questions or written on the chat thing. I don't know if anybody out there has anything further, but I believe the thank you, and it's time to thank, oh, wait a minute. Oh, Mark Wixon asks, given, like you said, quote, politicians are beholden to the ultra wealthy, do you have concerns? Oh, wait a minute. Do you have concerns around regulatory capture of a central bank if the system fundamentally changes and the central bank is to be overseen and controlled more directly federally? Do you get that?
I do.
Okay.
It's a question I'm asked, you know, in various formulations frequently. I think what the question is really raising is a larger problem about the health of our democracy and the responsiveness of elected officials to the desires of needs of the electorate. I don't think that constraining the ability of the Bank of Canada to create currency in the public interest is going to solve those problems. If we all have every reason to be concerned about the willingness of our elected officials, especially those at the top of the political pyramid, to respond to the needs of the population. But the way to address that is by reforming the structure of our democratic institutions. So, for example, you know, we need proportional representation. That's one thing we definitely need. That'll make the government more responsive to the demands of the populace and the needs of the populace. We need to democratize the media in this country. I mentioned earlier that, you know, the largest newspaper publisher in this country, Post Media, I think it has something like 2/3 of the newspapers in this country. And it's basically owned by a hedge fund based in the United States. And its CEO is, in my opinion, Paul Godfrey, way out on the right wing, the fringes of the right wing of the political spectrum. And he was even forcing during Harper's time in office, all of the editors across the Post Media empire to endorse Stephen Harper, whether they wanted to or they didn't. So we need to reform the media system. We need to shut the revolving door between regulators and industry through legislation. These are things, and there are many other things we can do to enhance participatory democracy in our society. If we did those things, then we wouldn't have to worry about the Bank of Canada being used as a tool to enhance the interests and the power and the wealth of the most privileged. So the answer is not to constrain the Bank of Canada, it's to fix our democracy to do its job properly.
Okay, thank you. The next is another question from Dawn and Heather Ross. And I'm just going to go in order that the questions have been written down. I'm not going to skip over people because they've asked earlier questions. But Dawn and Heather Ross ask, what role do you feel the PBO, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, could play in influencing government spending in the direction you are encouraging here?
So, you know, look, I have mixed feelings about the PBO. The PBO plays an important function. It is, and sometimes does very good work, but it is staffed and has historically been staffed by classical neoliberal economists. And so, for example, in the pandemic, the PBO has started to raise the alarm bells about the level of government spending. Now, of course, we shouldn't, just ignore the ways in which government is spending money. We should be sure that the government is spending money in ways that are serving the public interest, and we should be making maximum use of every dollar of expenditure. I completely agree with that. But the PBO tends to, be an adherent of this failed doctrine of fiscal conservatism that I've been critiquing. So, for that reason, I have mixed feelings about it. What we really need to do is put some progressive economists in charge of the PBO. And then we would see some really good work coming out of the PBO, far better work than we've been seeing to date. But unfortunately, that hasn't happened.
Okay, thank you. This is from Les Schramm, and he asks, would you support a just transition for the oil-producing provinces? That is, for loss of royalties, etc.
100%. And I said this repeatedly during the leadership campaign in the Green Party of Canada. I think we should be providing a jobs guarantee to workers in the fossil fuels industry and other industries that are dependent upon the fossil fuels industry for a minimum of 5 years. I think that we should be adopting, because the Alberta Energy Regulator certainly isn't going to do it. It's completely captured by the oil industry. We should be adopting a law which requires the fossil fuels industry to pay adequate security for the cleanup of orphaned wells and tar sands tailings ponds. And as Avi Lewis and Reagan Boychuk and a researcher in Alberta argued in a wonderful op-ed in the Toronto Star a little while ago, this would create what they call a reclamation jobs boom. The need for reclamation in Alberta is immense. And if it were actually being funded by the industry, as it should have been done years ago, you could create tens of thousands of jobs for decades. And the workers in Alberta are already trained to do this kind of work. It's not like you'd have to completely retrain them to do something they're unaccustomed to doing. So these are the kinds of things that I think if we really want to get the people of Alberta and Saskatchewan on board with the transition, then we have to provide ironclad guarantees to the workers who are going to be devastated by the transition. We can't allow that to happen, and we have to give them that guarantee.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And now I'm going to unmute Mina Lee Johnston, who says she has a comment. Mina Lee, are you going? You can go ahead.
Hi, Dimitri.
Hi, Mina Lee.
I spent the whole day on day-long webinars with First Nations, and they dealt with so much about economics, and even like going from GDP, where they estimate their contribution is billions, but there's no data for it, but they're trying to gather that. And they brought in, the Bhutan that, that they have gross national happiness, and this whole approach of economics, fiscal conservatism, that's they're going back to their own philosophy and thoughts of how the economy works. And the advancement they're making in solar energy and wind, and they're talking about they're going to be taxing corporations, they're going to be taxing government. Those are their lands, and so many of our resources come from there. So I'm really inspired by that, because I know that there's quite a movement. Even Seth Klein's been going around with his mobilization, and I think that there's a turning happening about how we view economics. And of course, we've got to keep pushing that through, the Kennys and the Harpers and all of them.
Yes, thank you very much, Miley. Actually, this reminds me, I was talking about the resolutions we're putting forward. There's one of the resolutions that we have submitted. The submitter is James Plewak, Plewak, who, member of the Indigenous community, he's from Manitoba, calls for the Green Party to support Indigenous communities having a veto, an absolute veto over the use of their land and resources. And if they did that, if they had veto power, then they could do things like stipulate restrictions on the scope and nature of activities of corporations on their lands. They could do things like impose taxes. They could say, look, as a condition of us granting you consent to the use of our land and resources, you're going to have to pay certain taxes for a prescribed period of time. So, if we take the universal, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Persons seriously, as Justin Trudeau claims, John Horgan claims, and other Canadian politicians claim, then we should, in law, recognize that Indigenous peoples have a right of veto, not just a right to be consulted, but a right to say no to the exploitation of their land and resources.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I have another question from Anne Grant. She says, if the feds give money for healthcare to the provinces, are they constrained, and I assume they means the provinces, are they constrained as to how they use it though?
I guess that depends on the terms of the funding. I mean, the federal government could say, it might say the only restriction we're going to apply on the province is that the money must be used to bolster the healthcare sector, and we're going to leave it up to you how to do that.
Yeah.
Or the government could be much more specific in terms of the conditions attached